Hello, this is Tom, the Star Frontiers gamer, and today we are considering the Nebula problem. You say, Tom, I'm a Star Frontiers fan and I've never heard of the Nebula's problem. I know, it's a problem I discovered. And I'm going to present it today with a solution, a proposed optional rule, and a potential plot hook for your campaign to take advantage of this. Plus, maybe a little bit of setting fluff to kind of give a little detail to the setting. So the Nebula problem started with a little bit of a deep dive into the timelines, Alpha Dawn timeline versus the Zebulon's Guide timeline. You say, Tom, I've heard of the Zebulon's Guide timeline. Where's this Alpha Dawn timeline? Glad you asked, because a friend of mine compiled it, and then I added a little bit of writing to the whole shebang, and we published this article in the Frontier Explorer. Links in the show notes. You will find the Frontier Explorer with the Alpha Dawn timeline. One of my favorite pieces, one of my favorite additions to the Frontier Alpha Dawn timeline, compiled from all the Alpha Dawn sources. Very cool. At any rate, I was considering the comparing between the Alpha Dawn and Zeb's timeline. And we get these little entries in here that say the greater morass is mapped. Then you have 77 to 57 PF. This is Zebulon's Guide timeline, obviously. The Zagig Dust Nebula is mapped from Zebulon to Frommeltar. Huge arc of the sky being mapped. And white light, 56 to 40 PF white light nebula are mapped, nebulae, plural. And then we get at the very bottom here, this little entry about 32 to 26 PF, that's pre-frontier. 32 exploration vessels are lost trying to map the lesser morass. With a little qualifying statement at the top of the other column is only the area between Screefron and Zebulon is mapped. Let's check that out, because this is what really set me on this path. The area between Screefron over here and Zebulon, this is what's mapped, but this area is what they were trying to map, and somehow they lost 32 ships. Now, we don't get similar entries on the Zagig, which is a lot of sky, white light, which is another 22, 24 light years top to bottom. The greater morass, about 10 light years across. And this is just like 8, 9 light years across. I mean, it's just not much to it here. Not much at all. And yet it's sucking up starships. And you got to consider these starships are probably scout starships. A civilian scout starship is going to price out at about 1 million credits for hull size 2. Let's say 1.5 to 2 million for hull size 3, maybe, if that. So let's just say at 32, let's say they were all 2 million. Just cost of supplies, cost of fuel, cost of the crew, insurance on the crew, insurance on the ship. Let's just say it's $2 million being lost every time one of those ships, 2 million credits, being lost every time one of those ships disappears. That's 64 million credits going down the drain. That's like a couple of destroyers, you could buy for that. I mean, it's you could certainly spend that scratch someplace else. I started thinking about this problem, and it got me wondering. And I thought, well, how big is a nebula supposed to be? Ask Google. Why not? Google knows everything. If it's on the internet, it must be true. Not necessarily, but I Googled how big is a nebula. Tens to hundreds of thousands of light years across. Well, we have a couple of nebulae in the frontier that would qualify as tens of light years across. Um, Zagig would, white light would, but the rest would not. And then I started thinking, I says, man, we've got like um, three or four other nebula that don't qualify as tens of light years across. Well, I mean, the mold is all up in the corner. We really don't know how big it is because we don't see the whole map of it. But you got a lot of individual nebula all crammed into a little tiny space, 50 light years by 50 light years. It just seems odd. It does not seem real. And so thus began this research into the nebula problem. So in doing these things, I approach it kind of like a research project and diving down. So I said, let's start with the original frontier map. Let's just see what's on there. Why not, right? Here we are. Alpha Dawn. Debuted at Gen Con, August 1982. This is the map that got us all going. This is the map that got it all started. Not a great presentation. It is in black and white, black for space. And we have some dust clouds represented on here as navigational hazards, but no names. Nothing named. So it's not a great map, but it shows the beginning, and certainly the biggest is what's going to be known as the Zagig dust cloud. The next map we got was from Dramune Run. Look at this gorgeous thing. You know, I totally discounted it because it was not as complete as the Zebulon's Guide map. But this is really, I think, one of the most gorgeous of all the canon maps that we got. And I just want to point out, they're representing dust cloud all throughout the entire frontier sector. Let's just file that datum away, put a pin in it, and we'll come back to it. But this is really a gorgeous representation. Then we got the Zebulon's Guide map, which gave us hard, fast names everywhere. You have the Zagig Dust Nebula, Zagig Dust Nebula, so this whole great arc up here across the north of the frontier. I use cardinal directions with these maps. Makes no sense, but north is the top, south is the bottom, east and west are right and left accordingly. So you got the Zagig all across the northern end, the Lesser Moraz, the White Light stretching from Achenkar all the way down to Liberty. You have the Greater Morass, which goes beyond this area, goes down towards Waller Nexus, and potentially links up to the White Light. Potential linkage here with White Light Nebula. It does link up. You do see some linkage here with the Uriva Nebula. Did I mention Lesser Moraz? This is a little tiny dwarf nebula right here. The little tiny micro nebula. And then up to the far northwest, we have the Mold Nebula. And I thought, oh, okay, so we see this evolution and change of nebula in the frontier maps. But I got thinking, I says for something that should be tens, and I don't, while technically 20 or 30 light years counts as tens, you know, in the case of the Zagig on this map, we're talking about 30. In the case of White Light, maybe 20, 22 light years top to bottom. Those two would qualify for that internet definition of nebula. Greater Morass, Uriva, Lesser Morass, these certainly do not qualify as a nebula. And Mold is just this amorphous little bit of color up at the edge of the map somewhere. So It just struck me as it would really make more sense if the whole area was all one. The whole area was all one nebula. That would make more sense. But yet we have these names. What to do with that? Well, I got thinking, and I remembered. I remembered seeing the pillars of creation. Let me pull that picture up for you. So NASA has produced these pictures of the pillars of creation, semi famous. You've probably seen this. Pillars of creation. NASA. NASA photograph, public domain. Pillars of creation are a nebula formation within a nebula. They're not a nebula unto themselves, but because they're distinct formation with kind of a interesting look, they've received a name. Thus and so the same for these little tiny micro nebula within our frontier. That the inhabitants of the frontier looking out into the sky with their telescopes, studying the sky around them, have identified certain structures in this nebula. And remember, the nebula really does cover the whole frontier. But they've identified these very distinct structures and named them, much in the same way as the pillars of creation have been named. So thus we get the Lesser Moraz formation, the Greater Moraz, and the Uriva formation. And I would just say Uriva, so this is the Yazarian quadrant of colonies down here. Uriva must be a Yazarian name. It must be like Yazarian for something similar to pillars of creation. Uh, you know, we can play around with that a little bit and come up with what does that Yazarian name translate as? It's an interesting thought process. You have the white light nebula. And I'm going to say, I'm going to take a stab here because I've also been doing a little bit of study on neutron stars. We got a little neutron star right here on the map, just kind of southeast of Solar Major. This nebula, viewed from the white light system, is going to be lit up by the white light by this neutron star. And maybe that has something to do with the name. You know, this star behind here is lighting up this area of high particle density, uh, giving the nebula its name from the light coming off of this very bright object, the neutron star. So that's my solution here, is to treat the whole area as a nebula, these named areas as structures. The Zagig Dust Nebula is not a particular structure. I want to reserve that as the name for the whole nebula, which seems fitting because Zagig is Gygax backwards. It's the first nebula to be named in Star Frontiers. So why not? Well, let's go with that. Zagig Dust Nebula is the whole name for the whole area, but these other areas here are formations within it. And on this particular map, the cartographer has, you notice, the jump route here on the jump out to Clayock, Crixia and Clayock, this whole rim jump route here. The Zagig Nebula appears to end at the jump route. Not so. It really goes all the way to the Mald. The Mald could be a separate nebula, or it could be just another structure in the Zagig Nebula. I'm going to go with these clear areas are the mapped areas of lower particle density. That's why some of them appear to be lanes between planets. You know, the jump routes seem to be in these lanes. And the central area where there are stars, and there are twin black holes in this area between Dramune Run and Madderley Star. A lot of this real estate in the center here has sucked up a lot of still particle density there, better than normal regular space, but it's a lower particle density for the nebula. These colored areas on this map are very much higher particle density. And the reason that you don't see a lot of these obvious jump routes that should be charted, like between Crixia, that was zoom in, between Crixia up here and Fromeltar or Clayoch and Kiskar, is because plotting a new jump route through the higher density, higher particle densities of these structures in the nebula incurs a greater penalty towards void jumping. And what happens is that for every light year you're plotting through these higher areas of particle density, it's an extra 5% penalty. So, for instance, this area between True Star and Cassadine is 5 light years, so that would be 25. But I'm going to actually propose slightly higher for here. Some of these areas could be slightly lower, like 2 or 3%. The average would be 5. And then one area, I'm going to nominate this. True and the Cassadine would be 10. And there's a reason for that. So that is my optional rule. And, having this greater danger of a misjump, of messing up your void jump, kind of enforces this map to stay a little static. It's not so apt to change because of that. So it keeps that in place, but it's still, it increases the danger, and that explains why some of these obvious shortcuts. Because, I mean, look at this. True Star, if you're Streel Megacorp, headquartered in True Star, and you want to ship some goods to Cassadine over here, 5 light years away, to do that, you got to make a jump to Dixon Star, from Dixon Star to Prengular, and from Prengular to Cassadine. It's a total of 17 light years. Total. Whereas this, I mean, people can look at the map and go, 5 light years that'd be a shortcut. Why isn't that mapped? Why has that not been mapped from the beginning of the Alpha Dawn game to the Zebulon's Guide map? It's not been mapped. Why? Well, it goes right back to that 32 starships that go missing in the lesser, look at it right here, Lesser Moraz. So let's consider what the Lesser Moraz really is. I did this map, and I drew this arc all the way across the sky here for the Zagyig Nebula, because you would think, just looking at it, same color, same color, same color, same color, same color, even in here, you would think this area is Zagyig Dust Nebula per the cues on this map. I think if you draw a line down the length of the Lesser Moraz and just keep extending that line, it goes right into this area that, while this area is kind of colored the same as this, it's actually part of this formation. Lesser Moraz stretches all the way to this line here, the 7 light year jump route line. So even though it looks like it's part of the Zagyig because of how the jump lines spider web out, it's not. So while they did call a moratorium on sending out the scout crews to die in the Lesser Moraz, all of those entries that did talk about mapping such and such nebula, what it really was about was it was finding the areas of lower density that are safer for navigation and charting that. They were not jumping through the nebula. They were not, charting jump routes. They were just maybe perhaps doing little micro jumps, little pop of the clutch on the void drive engine, like you pop the clutch on a motorcycle and it jumps. They just pop the clutch on the Starship and do these little micro jumps, and then they scan for particle density, and then they move a little more distance, light year, 1 or 2 light year, do more scans, take more samples, that type of thing. And that's what has gone on with the mapping of the White Light Nebula, mapping of the Zagig Nebula, mapping of the Uriva, mapping of the Greater Morass. Okay. The problem here is that this is just a really high area of density. Yes, they have punched a jump route through from Dixon Star through Truane Star, which goes right through the Lesser Morass. They got lucky. They got lucky with that one. Or that just happens to be a little tiny sliver of line of low particle density. But for the most part, this area between the Lesser Morass and the rest of the Zagig, this is an area of really high density particles. So that makes this 5 light year jump between Cassadine and Truane Star extra dangerous. Hence, I suggest the 10 per light year. So that would be 50% chance somebody attempting to chart this route, they're going to misjump. That's pretty high. I mean, that'll be responsible. That'll right there would explain 32 starships missing. Now, even though they call a moratorium on this, trying to chart this, I think the megacorps really want that route. But I don't think the megacorps are really willing to risk their own money. But what I do think the megacorps might do, because you chart a jump route and then you publish it with the UPF, 100,000 credits. Well, that's not a lot to go risk your life and never come back. But if you had 1, maybe 2 megacorps putting up some money for a prize, whoever the first one is to chart this route, whoever charts this route, Streel's put up 100,000, CDC puts up 100,000, because both Streel and CDC would love to see that route, wouldn't they? So I think both of those megacorps would put up the money to put up a prize. So if the megacorps are putting up 100,000 each for 200,000 plus the 100,000 you get bounty from the UPF, it's 300,000 for charting a jump route. But it's a jump route where you're risking 50% chance going to end in misjump, 50% penalty on top of everything else. So more than a 50% chance you're going to misjump scouting that route. I mean, and what does that lead to? Well, that leads to, let's take a look. If you're jumping from Truane Star to Cassadine, where are you going to end up? If you misjump, you will not end up in the system you intended to end up in. You will not end up in the system you started from. You're going to end up somewhere in a star system within 5 light year radius of Truane Star. There's the circle. What are your choices? Zebulon, Dixon Star, and a binary star. That's it. Those 3. Now, if ships end up in Zebulon or Dixon Star, they ain't lost. If they end up in this binary star, it really ought to be ridiculously easy to find location and then compute the jump to Belnefer or Dixon Star, one or the other. And then you're home. You're not likely to really get lost from here. And the next option would be Cassadine. So Cassadine, 5 light year radius, gives us Dramune. If you're feeling charitable, it gives you Dixon Star. It's right on the edge. You have a couple of binary stars and nothing else. But those binary stars, ridiculously easy for you to chart the very short hop. to Matterly star. So here's what I think. Because of the nature of the way void jump rules work, I believe that the void jumping mechanism, the hand wavium, how we interstellar travel mechanism, is tied to gravity wells in space, in the fabric of space, creating a gravity well. So if there's a black hole anywhere within your radius, that's such a bigger gravity well, or neutron star, bigger gravity well. I would think that those would become really huge magnets for a misjump. But other things could be acting as a gravity well, not these stars that we've discussed. You have rogue planets do act as a gravity well all on their own. If you've got nothing better to land, to land on in a misjump, like there's not many choices, but there was a rogue planet could pull in a ship. But better than a rogue planet, you could have a wandering brown dwarf out there. Now it's a planet not quite big enough to ignite nuclear fusion and become a star, so it becomes a brown dwarf. That could be a gravity well out there because it's quite a bit sizable than like Earth. It's a failed attempt by a gas giant to become a star. So, and you can't see them. They emit infrared, and you could certainly detect them with energy sensors, but it's a big sky. It's a big sky to scan. And, they're out there. They might have been seen on some scans, but not properly analyzed, and then nobody realized, oh, there was a brown dwarf there. I am going to propose a new addition to the setting, and that is a brown dwarf deep in this nebula formation. These ships, a lot of these 32 ships that misjumped, they ended up at that brown dwarf. And so I want this brown dwarf to be kind of deep into this nebula formation. Where do I put it? Needs to be within the jump radius circles for both True Star and Cassadine. And, that makes this area right in here kind of nice. And look, there's a little black dot already on the stinking map. Now, it's kind of a little bit of serendipity. I figure why not use it? It's already there. I don't even have to mark up my map. I know that's the dot where the brown dwarf is. And in addition, because that dot is at the corner of the square, I like to think of it as it's entering the next square. And if I was to draw a line following it into this next square, that line would intersect with True Star. So when they do discover the presence of this brown dwarf, somebody will work out and be like, oh boy, it's going to come awful close to True Star. However, and that sounds bad, like, oh geez, you're going to get this brown dwarf slamming into an established civilian center. Pale's got a high population density. At the speeds at which it would be traveling, it's going to take centuries for it to get there. So it makes a nice little, oh, hey, did you hear? There's a brown dwarf going to slam into True Star. They say it won't strike any of the planets, but I don't know. It's going to come awful close. It gives you a rumor for an NPC to be concerned about, even though it's centuries in the future. So that's a nice little story. And when you think about it, if exploration vessels ended up at this brown dwarf and we enforce that finding location is harder, plotting a jump route out of this location is harder, then that makes a lot of sense that 32 ships never came back. Okay, that works for me. And you've now got this prize, this, I like to call it the Cassadine prize. You call it whatever you like, because they have like the X prize, and they've had prizes for engineering and robots. But I like to call it the Cassadine prize, money put up by Streel for the Cassadine route. They just called it the Cassadine prize. And then later on, the CDC said, you know what? We'll put up some cash too. And they deposited, some credits with whatever law firm, and potentially, so some law firm is overseeing the escrow account of all the money. It's going to be a Versk trade house law firm. I love that idea. So they're the ones overseeing the Cassadine prize. They're headquartered here in Cassadine because Cassadine's multi-species colony. And you have a temptation. Extra money, $300K, you chart this jump route, but it's going to lead down a path of adventure. The players are going to end up lost in space. They're going to misjump. High probability trying to get out. They're going to misjump, which could lead to another misjump. It could be a total lost in space kind of campaign. Just oh my God. Where the hell are we now? Where in space is Carmen Sandiego? So it just could be a compounded comedy of errors. And when you get out here to this brown dwarf and they discover this brown dwarf, they would discover like D6 ships in orbit around it, or maybe the brown dwarf captured a rogue planet. The rogue planet's orbiting. You'd say, well, it's brown dwarf. It's not giving off light. Well, brown dwarfs have a habitable zone that is awful stinking close to the star. And it is that way because it's not giving off light, but it is giving off infrared. So it's so close that the brown dwarf would be tidally locked. You'd have a night side to be totally inhospitable because it's freezing cold. You'd have a day side very dimly illuminated by that star, but that would be the warm side. And so you'd have some starships maybe crash there, maybe even crashed on the night side, making that a hazardous environment exploration of a crashed ship. They might have to scavenge fuel off these ships for their ship. They might find a survivor if the planet orbiting the brown dwarf is within the habitable zone. So you have this potential for adventure, and it could lead to other adventure, and it could just be developed into a whole exploration campaign. And that is my solution to the Nebula problem. So this is Tom with the Nebula problem and a Nebula solution. All one big nebula. The named nebulas are formations, the pillars of creation. It's the reason these starships got lost. Higher particle densities, greater danger in trying to plot that jump. More misjumps occur. Streel Cassadine put up money for a prize for that True Ain't Star to Cassadine run. That could tempt the players. They got a starship. Hey, $300K. We could pay this. We could pay this baby off and get rid of these tracker implants. So yeah, that could tempt them. It could be a temptation, and potential for a whole beginning of a Lost in Space campaign while they're, and even if they get back to known space, they still haven't mapped the route because they misjumped. So this is Tom for the Star Frontiers Gamer and Tabletop Tap Room. Thanks for watching my video. Thanks to my subscribers. Guys, are great. Don't forget that like, subscribe, and bell icon. Click on those, please. And keep on gaming, and I'll see you in the frontier.